We now bring in the voice of the Mets here on SNY, play-by-play announcer Gary Cohen. And Gary, as you watched these negotiations from afar and the public posturing from the owner and all the leaks, what now is your reaction and your reaction to how the Mets played this out to bring Pete Alonso back to the Mets?
Well, my feeling all along was that Pete had more value to the Mets than he did to anybody else. And obviously, Scott Boras overplayed his hand greatly. Pete turned down a 7-year, $158 million deal before David Stearns took over. So the market was not what they expected, but I felt all along that the Mets would value Pete higher than other teams would, and that Pete would value his relationship with the Mets more than he would a move to another team. I mean, this is a guy who has a chance this year to become the all-time leading home run hitter in Mets history. And, regardless of how the marketplace treated him, regardless of how much of a hard ball the Mets played in the end, the fact of the matter is this was a reunion that was always destined to happen, at least in my mind. There was never a point, even when things seemed bleak last month, that I thought that Pete was going anywhere else. And this ends up the way that it should, with Pete Alonso in a Mets uniform, at least for 2025.
On the stage, an amazing day at Citi Field with Mets owner Steve Cohen when he made the comments that kind of went viral about the negotiations being exhausting. As you heard that, what was your reaction to an owner being that forthright in a public setting, and what impact do you think those public comments had ultimately on Pete Alonso coming back to the Mets?
Well, I don't know about that. What I do know is that the reaction from the public in that setting was that the fans made it very clear that they wanted Pete back. And, fans ultimately don't care what the terms of the contract are. That only matters to the guy who's paying the money and to the guy who's getting the money. All the fans care about is that Pete Alonso is one of their favorites. And I think what Steve Cohen was saying was we'd like him back, but we want him back on terms that make sense. And, in terms of what the marketplace was for Pete, the Mets felt as though they didn't want to give him a premium based on him coming back to the Mets, that they were willing to give him what the market would bear. And ultimately, Pete got a high value 1-year deal with a player option for a second year. And, if he puts up a monster season in 2025, he'll have the opportunity to go back into the marketplace after that. And maybe the Mets change their tune on his valuation. But, this is the way a right-hand hitting, fleet-footed, non-Gold Glove first baseman, even with his enormous power, is valued in the marketplace. And so this is what it came down to. And I think Steve was being very honest about where the Mets were in that situation. The fans at the same time were very vociferous in the way they felt about it. And ultimately, everybody gets what they want. Pete obviously doesn't get the years or the money he was hoping for when these negotiations began, but he gets a very big salary for 2025 and a chance to prove himself, if need be, go back on the market again after this season.
Gary, no one knows the history of the Mets as well as you do. You've been following this franchise since day one. So how do you put in perspective the excitement of this offseason, the roller coaster of this offseason, and ultimately what David Stearns and Steve Cohen have done for this franchise in this offseason?
Well, I wouldn't call it a roller coaster at all. The Mets won the offseason once they signed Juan Soto. I mean, that was the greatest, most important, most impactful acquisition in the history of the New York Mets. Then they went out and they re-signed Sean Manaea, and they brought in Clay Holmes and Frankie Montas and A.J. Minter, and Jesse Winker came back, and now the icing on the cake is getting Pete Alonso. The Mets have improved their position vis-a-vis the Phillies and the Braves in the National League East. I think even without Alonso, they would have gone in as the favorites. Now I think they're absolutely the favorites in the National League East. And the Mets won the offseason, and they would have had a successful offseason even if Pete had left. But as I said before, I never expected there to be a rift in the continuation of Pete Alonso as an all-time Met, and hopefully he stays for years to come. But at least we know he'll be wearing number 20 for the Mets in 2025.
And there's no doubt, to quote you, the Mets won the offseason. Gary Cohen, we really appreciate the time. Thanks for joining us here live on SNY.